Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this Friday afternoon, late in the afternoon. It's a hard time to join, so I'm really grateful for everybody who's kind of making it this far with us. My name is Carrie Tully. I am the panel leader, coordinator, so to speak, for our food sovereignty panel for the Decolonizing Economic Summit 2024. I am going to give a brief introduction of myself and then kind of introduce our panelists today. And we have a pretty exciting, juicy, and very near and dear to my heart conversation that we're going to get involved with. So I'm Carrie. I am the Director of Fundraising and Engagement with the Civil Liberties Defense Center. I've been there about a month and a half, which is wicked exciting for me. I recently was with the Wiyot tribe at the Dishkama Humboldt Community Land Trust, and before that was Save California Salmon. I am a co-founder and steering committee member of the Rou Dalagurr Food Sovereignty Lab and Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institute. And I am here with a panel of incredible humans who do really wonderful work on campus in the community. And let them introduce themselves. We have Karley Rojas, Chelsea Rio Gómez, and Delaney Schroeder-Echavarria. And go ahead, one at a time, of course, if you could introduce yourselves and give a little background in whatever order you please. Karley, go for it.
Great. Taiwei, Dakanulia Karley Rojas, Daktoka Taino descendiente Marocoti, Daktoka Oria Morong, Aluka Mawe Cuba, Ota Alulikat ke Wampanog, Ota Alulikat ke Hoholding. Good day, everyone. My name is Karley Rojas. I'm a Taino descendant Maurocoti person. I'm also of Spanish and French descent. I am from Morong in Camagüey, Cuba, and I also have been grown from the lands of the Wampanoag, and I currently live in Hoholding on the lands of the Seninghui tribal peoples. I am the research associate for the Rou Dalagurr Food Sovereignty Lab and Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institute. I am also a graduate student in the Environment and Community Program, and y'all will hear plenty about my work. So I will table that for now and allow my comrades to introduce themselves.
Delaney, you want to go next?
Sure, thank you, Carrie. Anin, bonjour, Delaney Indigenecos. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Delaney Schroeder-Echavarria. I am a graduate student in the Environment and Community Program, along with Chelsea and Karley here. I am also a program coordinator and graduate assistant within the Rou Dalagurr Food Sovereignty Lab. I am the student program coordinator for the Kelp Guardians grant with the Tolowa Dede Nation. I have worked for the Food Sovereignty Lab for since my undergrad at Poly Humboldt. I started out in the lab as an undergraduate intern, and now I am a graduate intern. I also am a descendant of the Anishinaabe Ojibwe peoples of Minnesota and Canada. My grandmother is a tribal member of the White Earth Nation. I am also a European settler mix, as well as a Latin and Basque Mayan descendant. I come from the land of the Payaquisham, Hashiman, and Tongva peoples, colonially known as Orange County, California. And currently I live on the shores of Batuat in Humboldt County on the land of the Wiots and the Blue Lake Rancheria. And I will open that up to Chelsea.
Yeah, thank you, Delaney. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Rose Gómez. My pronouns are they, them, ella. I come from the Mexican immigrants. I traveled a long way to get here. I am originally from the Central Valley, the land of the Yucats, and I think we're gonna get into my work, so I don't want to talk too much about it. I am currently a research assistant and going on to be an independent contractor for the Humboldt County of Education, working with the Native American studies model curriculum for all of California K through 12. And a lot of my work does revolve around campesinos and farm workers, and just indigenous ways of being with land, moving away from labor as profit towards just like embodying experiences.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I just gotta say, like, check out the cool ENC humans here on the call, all doing all the big things. And so grateful that we're all kind of able to be together in this space, to talk about the important, like, not just like the important work that's happening right now, but the important work that took place in order to get to where we are. And so I wanted to give a little bit of a background from like my own personal experience as to what went down with the Food Sovereignty Lab. If you all haven't heard about it, there is a Food Sovereignty Lab on the Cal Poly Humboldt campus. It recently had a grand opening. It's pretty incredible. This was 4.5 years in the making. As one of the students who was part of the like imagining of what we could do on campus to re-indigenize our space, to see it go from like baby concepts, like having conversations in the library as a grad student, with like my kid in tow being like, oh, like this would be really cool, to seeing what actually now exists on campus is just mind blowing. And, it almost brought me to tears when I saw the space for the first time in real life. And just so grateful for all the hard work that y'all are doing to like really keep the programs up and running and make them grow. So a little bit about the history of the lab. Like I kind of was referring to, this did spawn from, a student project that myself and my kind of classmates were engaged with as students of the Indigenous Natural Resource Management Practices course that was led by Dr. Kutcher-Risling-Baldi. This was in the the fall of 2019, where we were in the class. And, Dr. Risling-Baldi tasked us with this goal of designing a project that would last throughout time, something that would be impactful and meaningful. And so the class kind of got together and decided, like, we can't just make this decision. We need to get community input. And, we want to find out what Indigenous people in the community and on campus want to see. So we did just that. We, took surveys and polls and made phone calls and wrote letters and did some in-person, feedback groups to get like the details, the juice on what people wanted to see. And so after kind of compiling all that information, everybody thought that having a space where people could develop a relationship with their food and space, place, like selves, was what was needed. And so we are calling it the Food Sovereignty Lab. From that point, we had to apply for a space on campus. And, that process alone was just tumultuous. We had a really long process of like really getting the space, because we were just met with roadblock after roadblock after roadblock that was kind of put upon us by parties at the university that made it really challenging for us to get the space. And this was all during like the very beginning of COVID, when nobody really knew what Zoom was or what we were doing online or how we were supposed to like finish finals or do graduation with like no in-person anything. And so it was a really challenging time to begin with. And so after we actually finally were allowed to have the space that we now have for the lab, we were told that the university would not, allow us any money for the development of the project. And so we had to do fundraising kind of all ourselves. And so the students kind of hit the ground and did a whole bunch of fundraising. There was like over $200,000 that the students raised in the first several months of fundraising for the development of the actual lab space. Some of you might remember the kind of process that we went through. We had all different kinds of fundraisers and things that took place over the first year. And, then roadblock after roadblock kept kind of hitting, and we kept projects developing and growing, and we really were engaging with the community in every single way that we could without even having a space on campus that was like usable. And so really due to the very hard work of these wonderful humans here, we have grown awareness and support and money for this lab to be able to be what it now actually officially is. And so, once campus kind of reopens, likely, later on this summer or in the fall, people are going to be able to engage with the actual food sovereignty lab, the dream that we had 4.5 years ago. And so there's some really incredible, exciting projects that these students are going to be talking with you about today, both in like specific relation to the lab and the space, and also to their very like incredible research that they are doing, and how that relates to food sovereignty. And so I thought it's kind of your call if you want to talk about the lab and the things that are going on at the lab, or if you wanted to jump into your research and the things that you're working on as grad students. So take it away.
Just to hype up the lab a bit more, if Carrie's wonderful introduction was not enough, the lab started right in the classroom. It's a student-driven, community-facing project. We've now raised over $2 million, and that's all from grant funding and community donations. The interior of the lab now has a commercial-grade kitchen. It has Indigenous artwork, fridges, dehydrators. We aim to install a plant drying rack. And it is a continuation of the indigenized spaces on campus, and this incredible legacy of the regional community that has fought and advocated for themselves to have these indigenized spaces on campus, no matter what the administrative turnover is and the bureaucratic hurdles that need to be jumped through. So this is a continuation of a really beautiful legacy. And it is a space that serves for the regional food sovereignty of our students and our community. And we will have a number of upcoming events. We have an upcoming event this weekend, Saturday, at the D Street Community Center because campus is currently closed. And this starts at 11 a.m. We will have food trucks, panels, speakers, and we will also have some food that is subsidized for students, as well as some free books that face Indigenous and ethnic studies. So please come by. I will drop the flyer in the chat, and you can stay up to date on everything that we do through the NAS website, which I've also linked in the chat. We release annual reports about all of our incredible projects and our growing staff of, I think, 8 individuals at this point. Additionally, please look forward to the FSL magazine, our first ever Food Futures magazine that is coming out within the month. Thank you. I will hand it over to my comrades to introduce their research.
Miigwech for that wonderful overview, Karley. I also want to say that we don't just have a kitchen, but we have a whole Indigenous garden, traditional foods landscape, our acorn pit, and our salmon cooking pit. And we're right across from the Goudini Gallery, which is a native-run gallery right in Wiyot Plaza, of re-indigenizing this space. So it's not just the lab that's there, it is so much Indigenous artwork and Indigenous revitalization work that is being done in that entire area. And it's really amazing to be able to be a part of the lab. I started off as an undergraduate intern. I was actually the first intern with the lab, and I wanted to just work with plants. I have a background in horticulture science. I have an associate's degree in horticulture science, and my father's a landscape architect. So I grew up around plants a lot, and that was a huge thing for me. So I wanted to go in there and do work with plants, and it ended up turning into starting off as an internship, then getting asked to work on projects and getting asked to help on grants and getting asked to like, hey, can you do this? Hey, can you do that? And I just ended up doing so much that I would get offered something like, "Hey, can you do this?" I was like, "Oh, I've never done that before, but I'll give it a try." And it ended up being like a wonderful relationship, being able to be in a space and being able to help the indigenous peoples of this land in any way that I can in the space. I ended up doing so much administrative stuff. I had never been a graphic designer, but I ended up making all these reports and I never wrote grants and I ended up writing grants. So just being able to do stuff like that has been so wonderful. And I feel like we're gonna just talk about like our first initial interactions with the lab and then we can get into research because Karley, you didn't really touch on your research. So I kind of just wanted to say if like Chelsea, if you want to talk about like your first experiences with the lab and like how it's evolved over the time.
Yeah, Delaney, thank you. So I came to know the Food Sovereignty Lab kind of later. I did my undergraduate here at Cal Poly Humboldt, but I didn't get acquainted with the Food Sovereignty Lab or its work until my first semester so last semester, actually, my first semester of graduate school with the Environment and Community program. But a lot of my food justice work and a lot of my work is very place-based to where I grew up, which is the Central Valley or Pixie, California, to be very specific. So that's kind of where I will be talking a lot about, just because, this work is very place-based and you can't really take the experiences and what you've learned with the people that you've learned it with and the community you've learned it with and what you've built outside of the place and apply it to everywhere. So within this presentation, you're going to see me referring a lot to my home, which is Pixley, California, or the Central Valley, or maybe even Tulare County. I'll be using all three of those interchangeably. But my experiences in my work and all that I will be speaking to today is very place-based. Back in the Central Valley, so Central California. But thank you, Delaney, for offering that.
Can I just interject really quickly and say, first, I wanted to point out like that Delaney brought up Wiyot Plaza. And so some of you might not know what we're referring to when we're talking about Wiyot Plaza, but you did bring it up. So we should probably drop that in here. Wiyot Plaza it's an area on campus that is now formally designated. I believe it's like codified, like we're getting a sign, right?
I can talk about that a bit if you would like.
Cool. Yeah, go for it.
I was part of the NAS 331 class that was looking at developing an exterior space for the Food Sovereignty Lab in 2019. 2021, sorry, been around for a while. And this became Wiyot Plaza. However, we had to change campus policy. So there's a theme with the Food Sovereignty Lab, which is that we always have to change campus policy to make things happen and to get our interior spaces because these bureaucratic systems are not really built for indigenizing spaces on campus in spite of the long legacy of indigenized spaces on campus. So this required us developing a proposal for the landscape and tree subcommittee to the USFAC, which is bureaucratic speak for the entities on campus that allocate spaces. And they said, well, we've never actually had an exterior space formally allocated to a department. So we had to change the policy of the campus to enable us to allocate this exterior space to the Food Sovereignty Lab. And with this came the development of the first co-management agreement. To our knowledge, it's the first example of such a co-management agreement between a department and a university within the CSU system. So this co-management agreement forefronts Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in the landscape, which is language we really had to fight for over a period of an 8-month development. Between myself, the co-directors, and facilities management. As we developed this co-management agreement, it also became the base structure for all future co-management agreements in the university, as this was the first example. So in summer of 2023, we formally signed the co-management agreement and it was renamed Wiyot Plaza following the iterative naming of this space by Wiyot community members. And it kept being brought up that this is Wiyot Plaza. And really it was that if we call it enough, that is what it will become. So it did become codified formally with the university. And now this is an exterior native plant landscape. It houses our indigenous garden, as well as the salmon cooking pit, as Delaney mentioned, and an acorn processing area. We are also developing a sculpture garden We have a Craig Benson there. So it's coming to life. And now that we have an interior space, I think we will focus on the development of signage, including indigenized maps of Wea Plaza and the region developed by Tori McConnell in the area, and building out artwork and our different projects in this exterior laboratory. Carrie, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I have something that popped up on my screen and I can't get rid of it. There we go. So anyways, I wanted to say, Karley, I love hearing you able to like rattle through that in such a like succinct way, because I remember all of these things happening and you were so instrumental in all of those processes and writing those co-management agreements, and all of that stuff was just like, wow. So thank you for going through those details. I think that's really incredible. The other thing that I kind of was laughing at, Delaney, when you were sharing was, it sounds like you have like experienced Kacha as like a person in your life when you're like, oh, I didn't know how to do any of these things. And then you were like offered to try to do one of these things or one of those things. And then you just kind of took it and said, sure, I'm going to go for it. And, Katja likes to say about herself that she's a volunteer. She volunteers people what to do. And I am certainly like, I don't want to say a victim. Like I am someone who has learned via Katja to just be like, okay, I'm just going to try it. Never done it before. And I think that that's one of the beautiful things about all of the people that have come to work in this space, that a lot of us are kind of just like, I've never done that before, but I care about this. I'm passionate about it and I want to see it work. And I want to work with the community and the people that are like giving their heart and soul and time and money to seeing this come to life. And so I acknowledge the volunteering happening in your life as well.
I
So
would
go for it. All right.
Oh, I kind of wanted to respond to that because I've honestly never thought about it. I always say that it's basically because I say that I'm like kind of a yes man in that way, that I like to just, oh yeah, I'll do that. Yes, please let me do that. And it like it ends up just becoming that. And you know what, though, I think a lot of people who have a passion and who have a drive for something, they start off doing that, or they start off and they meet someone who inspires them. And Katja has inspired me, has inspired all of us here in so many ways. And we just like, we want to go and we want to do it. And all of us here like are so we want decolonizing to be our lived experience, and Katja would say the same thing. And a part of that is making yourself uncomfortable and doing things that you would have not done, but that you want to try to, even, in those ways. And yeah, I would also just say that it's like, anybody can do anything if you've got the right, you try, you can. Just got to put yourself into uncomfortable situations sometimes.
I love that. Super facts, like getting comfortable in the uncomfortable.
Connecting to the Food Sovereignty Lab, I think all of our graduate work is really interwoven with food justice and food sovereignty. So I want to invite Chelsea first to speak about their graduate work and how it connects to place-based food sovereignty and food justice.
Yeah, thank you, Karley. So as I've mentioned, I was raised in the Central Valley, or specifically Pixley, California, and I was raised by campesinos and within the campesino lifestyle. And that's kind of where my research is around. Because growing up in a predominantly brown Spanish-speaking immigrant community is kind of what shaped my worldview and values around land, labor, and social issues. So as I currently attend this like higher ed institution, my work is around submerged perspectives and land and labor relations for campesinos. But my specific focus is on care systems, ways of life, and joy, and specifically focusing on the re-indigenization of the culture around campesino and what it means to be a campesino versus a farm worker. So a lot of my work is to try to navigate the difference between what is a farm worker and what is a campesino, because a farm worker is a job title. Growing up with people who worked in the fields, I always thought farm worker were those were dominant identities, those who owned land, versus campesinos. It's a way of life. It's an embodied experience. It's a life way. It's a system. There are systems of care that come with being a campesino. Um, and some of the ways that like food, justice entered my life is the ways of care that I saw in my community, when we showed up for each other. I think it was very specifically, it was very apparent to me when COVID hit. And like that's kind of when I saw that the things that we did in a community to keep each other safe wasn't the same, or it was more pronounced within that hard time. Um, so where I grew up in Pixley, California is a food insecure place. We only have one grocery store, and the our like medium income for our community is like 20K. And so a lot of people don't have cars, or they take public transportation to get places. And with that, you have all of these people who work in the fields, who are pickers, like they work in the fields with fruits and vegetables, but they also don't have access to the same thing that they're working with. But a way around that, and the ways that we have come together as a community, is that people in higher positions within their work would ask to take fruit, like leftover fruit, like stuff that wasn't going to be used anymore, or just ask if we could take some. Um, and then we would distribute that to our community. So an example was my mom used to be a mayordoma, which is, I think the like direct translation in English is like a manager, but that's just like it's just a different like tier when you're working in the fields. So when my mom was in that position, and she held that position for over 20 years, she would always just carry grapes with her. Like she used to have a big box of grapes that she would just carry around, and she would give them to anybody. Like she would go to a school meeting, like a teacher conference, and she would take grapes to our teachers. Or she would like see people working on the side of the road, like working construction, and she would just be like, hey, y'all want grapes, and stuff like that. So we always had a bunch of friends and bunch of people who worked the campo, and who didn't just see it as a job title, but it really was a way of life to be able to share fruits, and to be able to share and care for each other in that way. And then my work really revolves around bringing in land and tying in how the story of the land is the story of us, the displacement, commodification, um, of the land. Like I can think of Tulare Lake, for example, how that displacement and how that commodification of the land was used for agricultural purposes and agricultural profit, just the same way that campesino bodies are used, and displaced and commodified for agricultural profit. But also seeing that joy and that care that comes out of when you are in a tough spot, the way that I've seen communities show up for each other, especially around food, and just kind of navigating, I guess, yeah, just kind of really hitting on why food is so important, and like communal ways that we've kept ourselves safe and we've kept ourselves fed and warm, um is kind of where a lot of like those experiences that I had growing up really shaped the research that I do today.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that, and the very personal stories. I feel like a lot of us can relate to a lot of the things that you just said. Um, and it really relates back to some of the other panels that I've heard, and like topics that we talked about yesterday in the TEK Decolonizing Restoration panel. But like I don't want to stop. So Delaney or Karley, if you want to jump in and go for it with your research, that would be fantastic.
Delaney, go ahead if you would like. Okay, then I will go. No problem. I am really excited to speak in like a public facing way with Delaney and Chelsea about the intersections of our work, because I think those are really valuable conversations to have. Um, Specifically, I think around trauma-based healing of landscapes and revaluation of relatives, and how that is really intimately related to bodies. I'm thinking about cuerpo territorio, that idea that our bodies are indivisible from landscapes. But putting that aside for now, I will introduce my own research. And I have a short presentation. So bear with me, it is a large project. My graduate project is place-based learning practices, a case study of human and more than human relationality at the tribal and Western academic institutional interface. This project started years ago, and it's really getting underway now. We've acquired, I think, over $40,000 in funding from various entities, including, say, the Redwoods League. HIFE has been renamed to SHIFT, but what used to be the Humboldt Energy Independence Fund, the USDA, which funds a fellowship for my graduate work, and the Humboldt Department of Sustainability, in addition to, of course, Native American Studies and the Rou Dalagurr Food Sovereignty Lab. This project is nested within the Food Sovereignty Lab, and the products will be housed in that space, accepting the products that are specifically for tribal community. Okay. Oh. And as a preface to all of this, all elements of this research and the constitutive case studies will be developed rooted in Indigenous community-based participatory research action paradigms, which is a big acronym, really just to say that community will participate in all forms of this work, from its conception and imagining to its realization, and all of the processes in between, including compensation. And this methodology includes kaula. Kaula being a Taino term that is a verb specifically around respect and reciprocity with the human and more than human relatives around us, that's rooted in listening, and then action based on what you hear. So this is bringing my own ways of knowing to this community where I am a visitor. And this is really essential to doing work in a good way that honors both my own practices as well as the practices of this land. So all of the elements will be formalized and developed through procedural and reciprocal feedback through ICBAR, developed with partner communities and collaborators, and specifically forefront the sovereignty and self-determination of tribal partners, tribal citizens, and Indigenous community. Okay. So really this project came about by thinking about Poly Humboldt community collaboration protocols and best practices for working with sovereign Indigenous knowledges and sciences, especially as Poly Humboldt has become a Cal Poly. And as you can see in the prospectus and a lot of the strategic planning elements, they base a lot on traditional ecological knowledges and Indigenous communities. I think using key terms such as Indigenous and TEK over 198 times in the prospectus. But if you look at the funding and where their attention is going programmatically, it doesn't really align. There aren't protections for Indigenous communities. There isn't funding going to these programs. So there's a really big discrepancy, right? They're not putting their money where their mouth is. And this can create a lot of potential places of harm, right? So developing these protocols of protection and deference to sovereign knowledges and sovereign nations is critically important as we think about working with Indigenous sciences and communities. So this specific project will inform on managing information within protective structures, courses and learning practices, resources for relational health with tribal community, and research that specifically serves the tribal community. So the DICTIC case study, there is one internal to the institution and one external to the institution in partnership with Blue Lake Rancheria. The one internal to CPH is Landscape Histories of Wiyot Plaza, and external to Poly Humboldt is Blue Lake Rancheria Living Database and Indigenous Agro-Ecosystems. Yeah, I told you it's a big project, so bear with me. I might take longer than my comrades. This is a logic model illustrating how these projects are interrelated. So really it's rooted in these protective protocols for institutional engagement, and thinking about how a tribal nation can work, or how a Western institution can work in a good way with a tribal nation. We're also thinking about developing research protocols within the tribal nation, right? So they have their own structures that such Western institutions need to defer to. An excellent example of such a research protocol is practicing Pikyav with the Karuk tribe. So this is one of the models we're looking at in collaboratively developing such a research protocol at Blue Lake Rancheria. And this research protocol will become a structure for research that's done in partnership with the tribe. In this living database and Indigenous agro-ecosystems, I'll go through all the products, but it's essentially serving for the rematriation of stolen Indigenous knowledges and the resurgence of those knowledges within community. At Poly Humboldt, as we had mentioned and introduced Wiyot Plaza, I want to be very clear that this is not an instance of land return, rather co-management. However, in instances of co-management as well as land return, the responsibility of the settler and the institution does not end with the development of that agreement or with land return, right? That land has been harmed for a very long period of time. So consideration of trauma-based healing of landscapes is really critical to how we reestablish relationship with that place and return that place to Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. So this project is really serving for the baseline of information we need to start that trauma-informed healing of landscape. I spoke briefly about Kawila and Ikbar, so I will skip through this. Introduction of landscape histories to Wiyot Plaza. So I've mentioned this is developing protective structures and protocols while working with sovereign Indigenous knowledges. There are specific outcomes, products of this case study, which include a beta ethnobotanical map, which was developed by a separate entity on campus, who then approached Native American Studies and said, how do we develop this map in a good way? So we're really looking at access structures and respecting Indigenous data sovereignty with this existing product by creating a beta version of the product for the bounds of Wiyot Plaza, and then working with tribal community to establish these access protocols and how such a resource can serve community. We're also looking at a site history of Wiyot Plaza, including archival information and possibly a modified phase 1 environmental site assessment, which is really just looking at the history of Wiyot Plaza as it's known through stories, through archives, through GIS maps, and how all of this information can be aggregated together to plan Indigenous remediation of that landscape. And this, of course, is a baseline for the development of an Indigenous biocultural remediation plan. And I want to reiterate that all of this is being done in the development and respect of Indigenous data sovereignty structures. This is an example of what the ethnobotanical map currently looks like. So we would be bounding a beta version of it in Wiyot Plaza, and then engaging what is appropriate for the public, what is appropriate for the institution, specific programs within the institution, and then the tribal community. Okay, the site history of Wiyot Plaza. So we've done some initial archival reconnaissance, I guess. I'm sure there are terms for this, but this includes initial maps of what Wiyot Plaza looked like historically within archival maps of the campus. So for example, this 1906 map of the city of Arcata shows what this parcel was when this Harps edition was added to the bounds of the city of Arcata. Like, this is the first map of this Wiyot Plaza being in the hands of the property ownership of the city of Arcata. So this is a good starting place for the schism of Indigenous care and relationality to that land as it was placed under the property ownership of the city. So we're looking at such archival records, developing these maps, and we're also hoping for this information to inform on pathways for cultural burning on the site. And of course, this will have implications in biocultural mediation. I'll briefly talk about the second case study, which is a Blue Lake Rancheria living database of Indigenous agroecosystems. So specifically, this is the goal of supporting the revitalization and reawakening of Indigenous sciences and knowledges and their intergenerational transmission while nested within protective structures rooted in Indigenous sovereignty. So these outcomes, again, this is through ICBAR. So all of these outcomes are continuously reciprocally modified within feedback structures, right? So we go to the community, I work with community, a tribal council member is on my steering committee, is on my thesis committee, right? So all of this is conceived of by the community and we're just contributing labor to making these visions happen. So this includes a research protocol that will be within the tribe for collaborative projects and research initiatives, a living database of plant relational knowledges, and through this living database and this process, identification of plants of cultural concern, and identification of their applications in Indigenous agroremediation projects, specifically with land return. So the living database is really what I'm most excited about. As an undergraduate, I started a database that was looking through archived materials, specifically like anthropological records around plant relationship information that had been misappropriated from tribes of this region by Western academics, right, and placed in these resources that were then removed from community. So this now exists as a literature review. And now the goal is to return this information to tribal community. So we are looking to accessibly format that information proposed as a living database and expand that information rooted in tribal community goals and food sovereignty initiatives. So this includes housing of information. There are databases that set precedent that house information at the intersection of cultural continuity and targeted preservation and remediation. So this will have the structure of a relational database linked to an interactive website, which is housed on the tribe server. And we're conceiving to expand on this information by speaking with language holders and really forefronting the goals of the tribal community in developing such a database. And we're looking at anti-colonial formatting of the website interface specifically. And it's really for the goals of documenting and preserving TEK that preserves its oral and cultural context, as well as in its current relationship, right? Because it's not static, it's not something from the past, it's something that's actively in relationship now. So this might include videos, Indigenous language information with audio files and literal interlineal translation, use of symbols and stories, and accessibility will be prioritized. So this is a conceived website page, what it might look like. We're forefronting Solot look here, but considering the history of Blue Lake Rancheria, there are a lot of Indigenous languages within that tribe, right? So consideration of the history of Blue Lake Rancheria tribe is really critical in thinking about what this research should look, what this database should look like, and how it can really serve the tribe. I spoke a bit about the research protocol, and we're thinking about the living database then being this well of information that can serve for Indigenous agromediation projects as the tribe gets land back and looks to heal that landscape based in trauma-informed remediation. The anticipated impacts of both of these case studies are contributions at the intersection of Western academia and Indigenous sciences, including courses, learning, teaching, and research resources, imagining and realizing precedent-setting content, policies, and protocols which respect, honor, and uplift Indigenous sovereignty and resurgence at the tribal and university interface, creating generational products for tribal communities, serving the resurgence of Indigenous sciences and food sovereignty, specifically through intergenerational transmission of knowledges, and applications in regional Indigenous agromediation and agroecological projects. Okay, thank you for bearing with me through my very long project.
That is, excuse me, that is awesome. Like, I'm like writing furiously notes. So, you know, if you notice that I'm looking down, it's not that I'm not paying attention to y'all. It's just that I'm like, oh my gosh, like, whoa. But like, I really have a sense of like the intention that you're putting into like every single piece of your project. It's very clear. And I like commend you for that. I think it's, you know, something I know about you as a human, but also like making sure that that is followed throughout your research is such like that's dedication. And so I appreciate that. Okay, Delaney, I want to hear all about your research as well. So go for it.
Thanks, Carrie. Unlike my other two peers here, I actually have not been able to get started on my project yet. With everything that has happened with dealing with the bureaucracy of the institution of the state governments, it's been difficult to get hands on the funding and all the things that we need to get off the ground. So we're still waiting on that. But I definitely want to talk about the Kelp Guardians grant with the Tolowa-Dini Nation. It is a California Sea grant, which is absolutely incredible. It's a very extensive grant that is going to the Tolowa-Dini Nation to help with kelp, bull kelp, just kelp in general. But I swear I say kelp so much that it like just comes off my tongue very quickly. Kelp restoration and revitalization, bull kelp in particular, as well as other native Wow, native species of kelp. Sorry, it is it's been a long week. But we are working very closely with the Tolowa-Dini Nation as well as our local kelp producers, including Sunken Seaweed off of Samoa, Hog Island Oyster Company, and our goal with the Food Sovereignty Lab and working with this grant would be to establish an internship program with the lab, working with students who are interested in kelp revitalization and restoration. This could be a student who maybe doesn't have an extensive understanding of like kelp on like the Western science level of raising kelp, but just a student who wants to engage in creating artwork, working on kelp restoration and revitalization. There are so many different people that we're looking for this internship, students in particular, working with Tolowa-Dini youth and elders around curriculum for kelp. We have a lot of really great ideas, but I don't want to talk about it too much because I haven't even been able to do any of the initial onloading. It's been so crazy, and we've been jumping through the hurdles of, going through Western bureaucratic institutions. So, but um, oh, thank you, Nicola. Sorry. Yeah, I always feel like when it comes to talking about kelp, if you grow up in California and if you grow up near the coast of California, I remember being a kid and walking on the sand and you're like, oh, gross, it's slimy. What is this? It's on my foot. It feels weird. Kelp, it's everywhere. It is an incredible relative. We see it all the time. We eat it, eating seaweed, eating kombu, any kind of kelp. And the importance of it is just how vital it is to our ecosystems of the ocean and also indigenous peoples of this place and their connection to kelp. Kelp has been used as a medicine, as a food, as a tool, as a basket material. Kelp actually absorbs more carbon than any on land forest, which is crazy to think about. But a lot of people think like, oh, we need to plant more trees. And it's like, oh, maybe we need to plant more kelp. So that's something that this project is very much going into because kelp, bull kelp in particular, can grow over a foot a day. That's something that takes decades for trees on land to accomplish. And, a lot of people do not think about our oceans as being, super, super vital to like the health of the air, the health of the planet in general. They are extremely. The health of our oceans is the health of all of our relatives, and very lucky to be a guest on this land and be connected to so many people who have such strong connections to the rivers of these places, to the salmon. The salmon have a huge connection to the ocean, and to the kelp in particular. There's just so many connections to kelp from all just human and more than human relatives of this place, all up and down California and even beyond. Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and across the world use kelp all the time. It actually regulates blood sugar, be very good for people who struggle with diabetes. There are all kinds of really amazing ways that kelp can heal our bodies. And our goal with this project is to get more Indigenous people, particularly youth, involved in kelp restoration and revitalization. And we're really excited to be working with Tolowa youth on this project. Elders, as they are knowledge holders and hold all of the knowledge of kelp. And I'm really excited to help with those connections between the elders and the youth, and helping with curriculum any way that I can. Again, it's been still getting up and going, and I don't want to say too much because I want to respect the fact that, I still need to have conversations with the tribe before I, talk about it too much. But those are all of the things that I'm super excited about. I'm also really excited for that the Food Futures magazine that Karley mentioned that'll be coming out. I wrote a piece in there and drew a picture of bull kelp, and there's also a couple other pieces in there that are about kelp and about indigenous kelp practices. So when that magazine comes out, definitely give it a read because there's a lot of information on kelp in there.
Thank you, Delaney. As you spoke, I was thinking about our next topic, like while listening, I wasn't, but specifically thinking about the restrictions and pollution of the inability of Indigenous folks, specifically in California, to access their traditional gathering sites, or the pollution of those sites and how that's impacted the ability of folks to engage with kelp as a relative historically. And we can talk all day about disenfranchisement from traditional foods as a result of colonization, right? But I think one of the connecting points in all of our work is specifically the revaluation of relatives and the return of access to those relatives and ways of knowing. And that really jumps out to me in the Kelp Guardians project through this forefronting of returning access to tribal community of kelp relationship, as well as the intergenerational transmission of this knowing. So working with both elders and youth, specifically putting money into that by increasing access and eliminating some of those barriers to education systems. That's really what jumps out to me around food sovereignty and food justice in kelp. But if Chelsea or Delaney, you want to talk about more specifically how your project connects to food justice and food sovereignty, I think that might be a good direction to take the conversation.
Oh, Chelsea, do you want to talk first? Okay. I really liked that you pointed that out, Karley, and something also when you said that reminded me is I think that we're also very much heavily interested in the importance of qualitative information when it comes to all of our work. Talking to our elders, talking to our youth, talking to tribal people, talking to campesinos, anybody that we are in our communities and that we work with about like their connections to land, and then how we can like put that out for them to be of service to them while they are doing their work, or while they are I don't like even saying that it's work, because like Chelsea said, like this is their lives. This is not just a job. This is the lives of the people. So like having the information to like, I think that that's something that I've always wanted to bring to this, be able to serve community here, is because, I am a guest on this land. I am not Indigenous to this place, but I want to serve the people of this land because I love this place and I love being able to be here, and I want to be able to be of service. So if I can be I always say like someone's got to take out the trash. And I'm happy to take out the trash, or not even that, but I'm happy to do the legwork so that people can do cool things, so Indigenous people can go out there, can gather kelp, can be on the land, have access to their relatives. And I think that that's beautiful. And if I can help jump through the bureaucracy and help with all of the doing all the paperwork and all the ridiculous stuff that unfortunately these systems of colonialism put all of us through, like I am more than willing to jump through those hoops for this community. And it's extremely important to me.
Yeah, and then I think I'll jump in here. So Oh, all right. So implications of food sovereignty. So I grew apart from my parents being campesinos, I also worked in the field, so I would consider myself within the campesino community. Because I also did that work really early on weekends and during the winter or during breaks. My mom would always take us. It first started off as like she would just take us and we would just play around in the fields, and then as you get older, then you get like slowly get some responsibility added to you. Um but yeah, I think the last time I worked in the fields was probably 2020, because then it got really weird. But so for food sovereignty, when Karley asked this beautiful question, my first thought was of so we there's this book called Lie of the Land by Don Mitchell, and it touches on the California landscapes and how they've been how the layout happened kind of for like the policing of campesino bodies, I think specifically during the Bracero program. So we live in this house that's just like surrounded by fields. We don't really have neighbors. Like our closest neighbors are probably like a mile away. And the field that my dad works in is almonds, but the field right across from us, um I think the last time I checked was corn, but sometimes they switch it up. But I just think of, so we have chickens, and sometimes when after they sweep up, they still leave corn and it kind of dries on the ground. And my dad will go out and grab it, like he'll take my brother, and we'll just go out there with the bag, and he'll just start putting like grabbing bag full of whatever corn was left. That like leftover is called titiche in in our culture. Just kind of like what's forgotten, what's kind of left on the ground. And like we would just go over and grab that stuff, and then my dad like would let it completely dry and then add other stuff to it, and then that's what we feed our chickens. So that's kind of what I think of when I think of food sovereignty, is just being like, even that act of just going over the road and grabbing like the food that is there, that like I know a lot of that like corn isn't going to go into the hands of the people who are working that corn and who are in relationship with that corn, or even the almonds that my dad works with, or the grapes that my mom works with. We have a very intimate relationship with the corn. Like when we first moved into this place where my dad works in almonds, the trees were 3 years old, and that's how old my little brother was. And now those trees are 18 years old, and that's how old my brother is. So kind of how we grow, like my little brother has known these trees his entire life. Like they have literally grown with him. But the fact that once the trees are shaken and the almond is picked up, we don't have access to that. And people in my community don't have access to that. But we know those trees very, very intimately. And we know the almonds, and we know how the seasons are, and we know when something's wrong just based off like a little bit of color is changed from the tree. Like we know those trees very, very well. And when I think of food sovereignty or food justice, is us having access to the almonds and to grapes and to corn, because we're the ones who are putting that care into it and being able to share it with the folks that make that. Because it isn't just us, like we're not the only people who work the corn and the almonds and the grapes. My entire community does. And to be able to grow up in a community that puts all of this care into land and puts all of this care into plants and to fruits and to vegetables, but we don't have access to the same things that we're taking care of. um yeah, so that's kind of what I think about when I think about food sovereignty, is being able to have access to the same thing that we're putting care into. And I have been lucky enough to be in a community that is very resourceful, unfortunately needing to be so, because we're the only ones who are going to keep each other safe and keep each other alive. And I think that was very, very prominent in 2020 when there was a big shutdown, when nobody had access to foods or even fresh fruits or veggies. We had each other. um so when I think of food sovereignty, I really think of my community, but I think specifically to the ways that we exist outside of these systems, because there's nobody in like the government or in like the bureaucratic system that's making sure that we're fed. We're making sure that each other is fed. And unfortunately, something like taking corn from across the street, or like asking for grapes at work, can be seen as stealing. So when I think of food sovereignty, it's the lack of that. It's the ways in which my community exists outside of those systems, and it's the way that we take care of each other and we make sure we're fed and we're safe. Um, I hope that answered Carly's question, and I hope that's kind of like what I'm trying to get at. But yeah, so when I think of food sovereignty, I really just think of the ways that my community has been able to resist against these like settler colonial violences and just exist and take care of each other.
That was so fire, Chels. Um, I think, I don't know, this reminds me a lot about how we conceive of food sovereignty, how I'm in relationship to it here as a guest, but also how it's conceived of like in my own community. You brought up the harvest of what is left over, what's on the ground, as an enactment of that food sovereignty, as like a submersion or as a resistance to the system that doesn't allow that for your community, right? You're not allowed to have the harvest itself. You have the titiche. And I'm thinking about the connection with food being how knowledge is held, right? How food is indivisible from knowledge. And I'm going to kind of speak about this as a system, how food sovereignty is so important to knowledge itself and just cultural well-being. So I think of, for the Taino in Cuba, we are the Guajiro Taino, right? That was the tribe prior to invasion. Pero because we were one of the first peoples colonized by Columbus, enslaved and fragmented. And I think there's a really big narrative for the Taino that we no longer exist, that we're extinct. Pero in Cuba, people that work with the land, I think a great majority of Taino descent, are known as Guajiro. And this is a word that's used all the time in our language. Like my family on both sides, my abuelo and my abuela, both of those families consider themselves Guajiro. Pero the word Taino has been almost hidden by the government. The government refused to acknowledge the continuity of this indigenous community. The word was outlawed, and there are still really intact Taino communities, pero in communities of descent that are maybe more disconnected due to this colonial fragmentation, the word that is used is Guajiro. So I think of this word as a titiche. It is this fragmentation that we are left with following immense genocide and colonization. But it's still an enactment of this relationship with land and this way of knowing and this cultural continuity, and specifically around food sovereignty, because Guajiros are not just indigenous peoples, they're specifically farmers. And I think a similar word is campesino. They're considered the campesinos of Cuba, and how we relate to the land and how we care for the land. And I think of Guajiro también as this access to knowledges, this cultural continuity of knowledges. And I think of this knowing as like indivisible from food itself, right? So you talk about maíz. We also have maíz, but I think we are more of a yuca people. So we would have yuca as well as frijoles. I'm kind of biased. I love my frijoles. But we would have yuca with every meal. And it's that preparation in the kitchen. It's speaking to your relatives about how it's prepared. It's about being in the landscape, seeing how the yuca grows, where it grows. It's a form of kabula. It's a form of this like listening and reciprocity with the land that is then on your dinner table, which you consume, and it becomes part of your body. And it's that linkage between the body, the self, your community, and cultural continuity in the landscape itself. So I think of indigenous food sovereignty, and I'll just define food sovereignty in case we haven't really clearly defined that. Food sovereignty in a broad sense is the ability of a community to make decisions about how their food is grown, where it comes from, and how they consume it and prepare it. And indigenous food sovereignty is a really specific arm of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is a word developed by La Via Campesina, but indigenous food sovereignty specifically, I think, has this element of cultural continuity and landscape relationality. So thinking about titiche in my own research here as a guest, like ethnobotanical knowledges, going back to this research presentation, all of this has been removed piece by piece from community, and through colonization, a lot of these knowings have been fragmented. I'm not saying communities don't have traditional ecological knowledges that are continuous and robust, but I'm also saying that a lot of it, along with language, and intergenerational transmission, has been really intentionally stolen as a project of this genocide that's been visited on Turtle Islands and Abya Yala. So what is left over, like the project of this living database, this is an enactment of titiche. We are picking up what is left, what is in archives, what's still in our elders' memories, and trying to make a harvest out of that can move forward for future generations to heal this trauma and to move forward and build new landscapes of relationship. Yeah, thank you so much for your really beautiful conception of food sovereignty, Chelsea. That was fantastic.
And if I can, sorry, yeah, if I can just very quickly add on to Karley was saying about Titiche. So I'm Chicana or Chicane. And I use that, identify with that. And within like the Chicano identity, we have something called rascachismo, rascachismo, and just like Karley's add on to like Titiche. So like the concept of um the concept of rascuachismo is like taking what you have, taking whatever you have access to and making it into something beautiful. It's specifically like art that's this word is kind of used towards, but it's just like that same idea of like you use what you got and you make the best of it and something beautiful always comes out of it. So I really do enjoy how we're just getting in the conversation all of these ways that um despite the violence, despite the horrors, we are still here and we are still being very loud and joyful, and we're still very much taking care of each other. And I just think that's really beautiful. So I just really wanted to add on to that really quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, no, miigwech to both of you so much. I realized after you said your question, Karley, that I did not answer it when I initially made that first statement. But and I feel like my feelings about food sovereignty are a little bit different because of my just disconnection from my culture has just been so it's taken on many generations, unfortunately. And I am one of the only people in my family that actually engages in these teachings and actually talks about it quite a bit and talks about like those connections. We've just been there's a lot of generational trauma with a lot of indigenous peoples everywhere. And through years of colonization, years of genocide, boarding schools, mass assimilation. There's still a lot of fear. There's a lot of shame still. And it's very sad and disheartening, but I'm very, very grateful to my peers and to all of the youth around the world that we're seeing right now who are engaging and who are talking about indigenous sovereignty, who are talking about the rights to have land, the rights to have food. Like, this is important to us. We're not just going to stand by. We're not just going to not talk about it. We're not just going to pretend like, that was so long ago, or, and I think that that's what food sovereignty means a lot to me, is just bringing it forward and having it here with us in the present for our futures, having that kind of solidarity with each other, and also just solidarity with our relatives, our human more than human, just standing by, being our protectors. That's something that, is very much tied to the matriation of the land, very much tied to just how indigenous people have lived since time immemorial, is just being the protectors. And that's something that I want to do going forward, is to be able to protect it, because as our elders get old, it's our job as the youth to hold on to those teachings and to you know um write them down, keep them, hold on to them, reteach them, make sure that they stay alive and that they're able to go on for 7 and more generations.
Delaney, that really stuck out to me, specifically around this connectivity globally with Indigenous folks, right? Because indigeneity is a colonial concept. It was developed to say like people that belong to a place and are in relationship with that place. But like we didn't have that word prior to colonizers coming, right? We were just people of that place. We were Taino. You were Ojibwe, right? And I think this connectivity is a really important conversation to have around the solidarity that we must have in liberation, right? In our interconnected liberation. I'm thinking about this as the decolonizing economics panel. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I see kaula as revaluation. This is a methodology that I'm engaging with, and how this revaluation specifically contravenes like the colonial racialized capitalist system that is upholding these systems of oppression and reiterating them. I'm thinking about how fundamental it is to actively revalue our relatives and act in reciprocity, in order for this resurgence to actually happen, right? We can't keep reiterating this capitalist system and thinking in this way, and think to disrupt that system. We need to be outside of it. We need to exist in submerged landscapes of care, like the landscapes that Chelsea's talking about in their community. And I think about Chelsea's work and how they're actively valuing the community around them. They have this intimate relationship with the more than human relatives. And this is a specific enactment of liberation and submerged resistance to this capitalist system. Um, I think of capitalism as this exploitation that removes people really intentionally from relationship with each other and from their landscapes. And this is really the subject of what settler colonialism is, as well as colonialism in different facets, right? Settler colonialism specifically disrupts indigenous continuity with place and replants that with the settler who move to nativism and say, oh, we are the people of this place. There was no one that came before. But even within the settler colonial landscape, they still need to have places from which they exploit. And often that's places in oppressed communities, that's indigenous lands that are held in reservation, that's places in Abya that become what are death worlds. They're just spaces of exploitation and extraction. And this then recruits those communities that are subject to this extractivism into that capitalist wheel, right? Those lands are then taken and those resources are placed into this capitalist system, which tries to grow and grow infinitely and just leads to more lands being exploited. And this quote unquote infinite aggregation of resources, which is really impossible. So this creates further and further death worlds. And I think of Ekele Mbembe's work of the necropolitic and how as capitalism has advanced and the imperial has really grown globally to expand these death worlds and these sites of exploitation and extractivism. Ekele Mbembe's necropolitics talks a lot about Palestine and how Palestine is a really excellent example of this death world where it's a site of settler colonial violence visited really acutely upon a people that is a site of unexceptional death with like extreme dehumanization, specifically for taking of these resources. And I think if we are looking at what these death worlds look like in a really concentrated place, Palestine is an important place to talk about, as well as the resistance that is engaged with the indigenous Palestinian people that's in solidarity and relationship with the people of Turtle Island and Abya Yala and our histories of genocide and our interconnected liberation. And I'm kind of going off. I might have lost the thread. But I think in order to contravene these projects, these death worlds of exploitation and expropriation, it requires these conversations that link this solidarity and liberation really intentionally to revaluation. I think of Palestinian food sovereignty and how one of the really intentional projects of Israeli settlers is to cut down olive groves and to make land inaccessible and to remove people from having sovereignty over their food, that it's an apartheid system and that extends to food and knowledges. And that's because food is really the baseline of cultural continuity. So thinking about projects of revaluation and indigenous food sovereignty, this is really contravening the capitalist project. And it is in this that like, I think our liberation and resurgence really comes from. It's from these food sovereignty projects that are interconnected with our liberation. And these are not things of the future. They're happening right now, in spite of the genocides, in spite of the death world, in spite of the really intentional projects of removal of knowledges. These knowledges are being reborn and recreated every day. I think about Chelsea's community. I think about how they engage Tipiche as the continuous enactment of knowing and relationship. I think of the projects that we are doing in the ENC program and how we are contravening these death worlds one piece at a time and creating these futures of intergenerational transmission. And I lost the thread, but I thought that was important to talk about. Mm-hmm.
Wow. I have so many things that I've written down so far that you all have talked about. But in order to like, I just want to see if there's a response that either of you, Delaney or Chelsea, have as to like what Karley was just bringing up.
I think Karley said it all. I just think about all the stuff that, it was very powerful. I felt very connected to that. And yeah, like it's, I feel like this happens a lot in our spaces when we're all together and when we're talking about food sovereignty and we're talking about liberation, we're talking about anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism. It's just like it gets you right in your chest and you feel it, and it kind of just like hits you all over your body and you're just like, yes, I felt that in my bones. So That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, and then I would definitely like to give my 2 cents on what Karley said. I think, yeah, Karley had said it very perfectly. But just like bringing that back to my own community, I think I mentioned at the beginning that the way that I grew up in relationship with land and relationship with my community members and people um who did do this work alongside of us, like it yeah, it's just beautiful to grow up in this community and to be in relationship with each other and to be in relationship with the land and the fruits and the vegetables and the cows who gave us milk, and to just be in relationship with our more than human relatives in so many different ways. And I feel like, and yeah, so what I was saying is that I mentioned this early on, but this way of life that I grew up in, this embodied experience, this vivencia, is what led me to my values very, very early on. Like just seeing this world and then having to go to school and step outside of it was just very jarring for me. So like growing up and just being in relationship with land and with animals and our more than human relatives, and then having going to school and being taught the exact opposite was just very just separate experience for me. Like they were so different. And I think that's kind of what early on really got me into thinking about, okay, well, these are two very different systems. These are two very ways of being and ways of living. And I think yeah, that's why very early on I kind of caught on to this idea of like, my liberation isn't just for us and the people in my community, but it's for everyone. And until everybody is liberated, we're not liberated. So just kind of tying back to what Karley was talking about with Palestine and the people of Gaza currently, um, I think our work is very important, but also being in solidarity with them is also very, very important. And unless everybody is liberated, nobody is liberated. So thank you, Karley, for bringing that up. I think that's such a very important point to tie in.
And I want to just connect back to Chelsea, speaking about this jarring experience of Western educational institutions, because I think this is really critical to the conversation we're having now, what's going on with Poly Humboldt, with the Solidarity encampment. I want to say that education systems, Western education systems, are one of the pillars of colonial violence. It is through education systems that Indigenous peoples have been really intentionally fragmented from their ways of knowing. It is Western education systems and institutions, these academic projects, that these Western ideals and ways of thinking about the world have been perpetuated. And it's these continuous perpetuations and feedbacks of how the Western system quantifies the world and valorizes it within structures of who gets to be human, who is less than human, who is Indigenous, who is Black, who is brown, who is in relationship with the land is less than human. And thus we are the subject of the creation of these colonial death worlds because we don't have the right to life. It is only the white settler society, the colonial society, the imperial metropole that perpetuates capitalism and these ideals about how the world works that gets the right to life. And I want to really underscore the responsibility that Western education institutions have in the reiteration of this system, because this is the foundation of how we have been quantified, like skulls measured, placed in museums since invasion, right? And it's these same quantifications about who gets to be human, who gets value, how that's contextualized within the continuation of a capitalist system, what is valorized and for what, and how Western institutions continue to reiterate this. So I think about boarding schools and how Indigenous peoples were really intentionally fragmented from their languages and thus ways of thinking and ways of knowing the world, and how it was supplanted with colonial ways of knowing and this education system. And there have not been reparations. There's not really been an accounting within Western knowledge systems about how these institutions continue this violence. And I mean, in the ways that they teach, but I also mean very physically, like these institutions are on stolen land. I think of the land grab university projects that maps how stolen land was sold to fund public universities across the country. There are connections in terms of how knowledge is continued, how land is continuously stolen, and how it continues to produce death worlds, such as in how universities are actively invested and profiting on the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Palestine, in Congo. we as academics cannot divorce ourselves from this and wash our hands from this responsibility. These need to be really forefronted conversations. And as Indigenous, as Brown, BIPOC peoples within institutions also have responsibility to their communities and ways of knowing. And sometimes this comes at a cost of even having a relationship with a Western institution, because it is this jarring thing. You can't necessarily exist between two worlds. It's a two-way form of seeing. Like, you can do your best to take what you can from Western institutions and how that can serve your community, but at the end of the day, that it really takes building a new system, and supplanting this existing system that continues to build these death worlds on our backs. So with all that said, I want to really applaud the students that were at the Cal Poly Humboldt encampment, in spite of its really violent disruption, by this institution and by these militarized continuations of capitalist interest, because that really is how change can happen and how we can build better worlds and build radical futures for our communities.
Thank you so much. I feel like that's a really good place to like maybe not conclude, because I know we definitely want to leave a couple of minutes for questions, but really tying it back to a lot of the other panels that I've seen, certainly the one that I was participating with yesterday in regards to TEK and decolonizing restoration, in that like taking care of our community, like allowing one another to be vulnerable and like giving space to the people that are in there working and showing up and bringing awareness to and fighting all of the structures and systems that are literally just pushing us all down. Just remembering to like be there for one another, and like that these acts of solidarity, these acts of building community, these acts of supporting one another, like we are like those are decolonizing economics. Food sovereignty is taking care of one another, and food sovereignty is decolonizing economic, like they're all interconnected. And so really the connection with yourself, with your food, with your community, these are all like they rely on one another. We can't have them stand alone. And we cannot stand alone. You know, we all need each other in order to get through all of these really challenging and very intense moments that we're currently experiencing. So thank you for calling all of that out. I feel like it's really important to tie it all together. I know that the chat has had a lot of chatter, and so there are a couple of questions, but if there are any in particular you all wanted to pick out, you know, there's a little bit of confusion. I don't know if anybody wanted to talk about kind of pulling that apart. And there was a kind of specific request from Nelson Betancourt. I'm happy to read them, or you can all kind of just address them if you wish, whatever works.
Yeah, Carrie, if you could pick them out and maybe we can address it, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so the first one was from Nelson. Could the panelists share ideas about how to implement food democracy in our communities, not just Native communities? I live in Orlando, Florida, although this conversation has made me more aware of Indigenous issues, concerns, and presence. I live in an urban world that wants less urban sprawl and more farmlands. Something I think a lot of people can relate to, as we're kind of like lucky to live in this beautiful Humboldt County, but that's not everyone's reality.
I just want to say something, and then I'll bring it to you, Karley. But I just want to say, and I know that Karley and Chelsea are gonna agree with me. All issues are Indigenous issues because all land is Native land, and everywhere you go is Native land and is owned and in the protection of some people. And the unfortunate thing that Karley already touched on very beautifully was just how education does not teach us that these lands were loved and cared for thousands and thousands of years, long before cities were built, long before colonization, long before even the English language was created. So, like, you know, when we talk about these issues and we talk about being in land and we talk about being on land, all land is nature, no matter where you are. Nature's everywhere. Even if you are in the hustle and bustle of Manhattan, you are in nature. And that nature is owned and cared by a group of people and by somebody. And I will because Karley has more experience in that, I will give that to Karley. But I just wanted to say that about your question, Nelson. I just wanted to make that very clear to everybody here. All land is native land.
I absolutely agree, Delaney. All land is native land. And I would say that this is a conversation that comes up really regularly in people that want more sustainable food systems. They ask, they're like, well, that's great for Indigenous peoples, but I don't know how this connects to the food security of my community. And I understand this. But I'm going to forefront what Delaney said in that all land is native land. And let's kind of roll it back to pre-invasion, where all of this land was known, it was all named, and all of this land was food landscape. The ecosystems that conservation wants us to think are untouched and out of relationship, like national parks, all of this land was what in a Western term is an agro-ecosystem, but these were all landscapes of relationship that produced everything communities needed. And they still do when communities are allowed to maintain that relationship, right? So in order for communities to have food security, like when we say land return, we're not going to say, oh, everyone that's native isn't native, gotta go. That's not how it works. We're in relationship with each other, we're in relationship with the landscape. But to return to a good way of being in relationship with the landscape means forefronting Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous ways of knowing of how to care for that landscape and return it to a health, return it to a system of health where it does actually produce for your community. So returning food security to communities means forefronting Indigenous food sovereignty, because that is how, those are the communities that know intimately since time immemorial what these landscapes look like, what kind of care they need, what kind of relationship you need to be in to take care of that food landscape and all of the more than human relatives there. And with the health and like trauma healing of those landscapes will come food security for everyone that lives in these lands. So I'm going to say that Indigenous food sovereignty and security is one of the most important things we can do to ensure the food security of all of our communities.
And if it's okay, I just want to tag on real quick. Even within my community in Pixley, California, or the Central Valley, as an Indigenous community who isn't Indigenous to these lands, we still, at the end of the day, we are still going, like, whenever I think about my long-term plan of food sovereignty for my peoples, I still very much see it being in relationship with the Yukuts, the natives or the Indigenous folk of the Central Valley and of Pixley, California. It is to be in relationship with them, because although we know these agricultural landscapes very, very well, at the end of the day, the only folks who know the landscape prior to colonization are the Yukuts. And whenever I think of my liberation, I think of being in relationship and being in community with the Yukuts, the native peoples of those lands. Because for my family, and I'm probably speaking for a lot of other families in Pixley, we have been displaced here. Like, it hasn't been a choice to be here. We were taken away from our homelands and put here as laborers and as bodies to provide profit for capitalism and the industrialization of agriculture. So whenever I think of giving land back, I'm not too worried. Like, I know my family isn't too worried, because we know how to be in good relationship with the land. And at the end of the day is to find other people who are also in good relationship with the land and who are willing to put in work to like have this relationship and have this community. So even for other Indigenous peoples who's aren't Indigenous to the lands that they live on, at the end of the day is still to be in relationship with the Indigenous peoples of this land and to give their land back, because at the end of the day, even though we know the agricultural lands and the landscapes very, very well, the only people who know the Indigenous and like the Indigenous ways of being within this specific land are the people who are from here.
Yeah, I just want to underscore Chelsea's call for land return. And this, it's really critical that unless you are an Indigenous person of the place you're standing now, you are a visitor on that land. So that comes with responsibilities as a visitor. That comes with a requirement of enacting relationship with the peoples of that place and ensuring their well-being as a guest on that land. So for settlers that want food security, like I saw Thomas's comment, how to transition from a colonial capitalist food production system, that really is land return. And that's equipping yourself, your community, with ways of being in good relationship with communities of place and using the tools and resources you have to serve that community. So whatever that may be, whether it's an area of expertise, whether it's monetary resources, whether it's land itself, that you should be leveraging those resources at the direction and as driven by the sovereign communities of place, sovereign indigenous communities of place. And as we move forward in a generational way, this is what will produce a future for us.
Awesome way to end. I think the whole funding aspect and like financial need to be able to like effectuate these like very real like situations that we're all kind of facing, and yeah, definitely thoughts on our minds, is like a whole nother topic that would be like a whole nother session. And the inaccessibility to money and the way that money is directed by the state and all of the things that are tied into how to get money in order to build out programs that would decolonize like our food systems. But yes, land back all day. I know that like we're already past time. I just want to throw it out there that if there are links, flyers, things, I know that there's a lot of stuff happening right now with the Food Sovereignty Lab. We have events happening this weekend. If there are other links you want to toss into the chat, once again, Karley, or anyone. And while you do, just thank you so much to the three of you. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be on a team with you, to continue this really important work. I'm so grateful for having such dedicated, like mindful, wonderful, like intelligent, brilliant humans. If anybody has any quick last words, you're welcome to share, and then we can sign off.
Give land back.
And come to the Indigenous Food Festival tomorrow. Karley put it in the chat. And also donate to the Food Sovereignty Lab. We are always looking for donations. Like Karley said, the best way to help Indigenous people of the places that you are at is to give money when you can, and if you can, and yeah, and I just want to say miigwech, thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you, Carrie, for facilitating this, and Dr. Walters for all of the work that she does for Decolonizing Economic Summit, and of course to my peers Karley and Chelsea for all of their hard work and their amazing projects.
Hahom for having us, with great appreciation and respect to the folks in the room. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.